There is a place on this earth where the richest civilization in the ancient world was built, not by its rulers, not by its architects, and not by its armies. It was built on the backs of slaves. This is the story of the most dramatic escape in all of human history. It is a story of oppression and liberation, of one man called out of obscurity to stand before the most powerful ruler in the world, and of a God who heard his people crying out in the dark and answered. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you breathless. 4,000 years ago, Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world. No army could stand against it. No nation could match its wealth. The Egyptians had figured out how to build structures so precise, so massive, so enduring, that we still cannot fully explain how they did it. And at the center of all of it, a man the Egyptians believed was not just a king, but a god, Pharaoh. But beneath all that gold and grandeur, there was a secret Egypt tried very hard to hide. The pyramids did not build themselves. The temples did not rise without hands. The cities of Egypt were not constructed by free men, deep in the mud and the heat. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in conditions that would break a lesser people entirely. They were called Hebrews. That Pharaoh was long dead now. A new king had risen. One who did not remember the goodwill, one who looked at the growing Hebrew population and did not see neighbors. He saw a threat. The Bible records Pharaoh's exact logic, and it is chilling in how familiar it sounds. He said, "Look, the people of Israel are more numerous and powerful than we are. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will keep multiplying. In the event of war, they might join our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the country." Notice what he said. They might. They hadn't done anything yet. There was no rebellion, no conspiracy, no threat, but Pharaoh looked at people who were different from him and decided they needed to be crushed before they had a chance to rise. This is what fear does to powerful people. It makes them brutal. The Egyptians forced the Israelites into back-breaking slavery. They worked them ruthlessly in mortar and bricks and every kind of field labor. The Bible uses a specific phrase. They made their lives bitter with hard service. Not difficult, bitter. There is a difference. Difficulty can still carry hope. Bitterness is when hope itself becomes hard to hold. But something extraordinary kept happening. The more Pharaoh oppressed them, the more they multiplied. The harder Egypt pushed, the stronger Israel grew. This terrified Pharaoh more than anything, so he escalated. He went from forced labor to something unspeakable. He ordered the murder of every Hebrew baby boy. Pharaoh's decree was simple and horrifying. Every son born to a Hebrew woman was to be thrown into the Nile River and drowned. It was a policy designed to wipe out an entire generation, to ensure that, eventually, Hebrew men would disappear from Egypt, and with them, any threat Pharaoh imagined they posed. It was genocide, in broad daylight, justified by fear. And into that darkness, a baby was born. Her name was Jochebed, and she had already hidden her baby boy for 3 months, an act that required a level of courage most of us can barely imagine. 3 months of hushing his cries, of moving him in the dark, of trusting her neighbor's silence. 3 months of looking at her son's face and knowing that the soldiers were still out there. She could not hide him any longer. So she did something that looks like giving up, but was actually the most profound act of faith in the story. She let him go. There is a moment in this story that I want you to pause on. Jochebed placed her son in a basket, in the very river that Pharaoh had decreed would be the instrument of his death, and trusted. She could not control what happened next. She could not protect him any further. She could only act in faith and let go. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open our hands and release the thing we love most into the care of God. Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe in the Nile that morning, as she often did. She was a royal woman, surrounded by servants, untouched by the brutality that existed just beyond the palace walls. And then she saw it, a basket among the reeds, moving. She opened it and saw the baby boy, and he was crying. The Bible says she felt sorry for him. Just that. 4 words. But in those 4 words, the entire plan of Pharaoh begins to unravel. Because this woman looked at a Hebrew baby, a child her own father had ordered killed, and she chose compassion over compliance. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. She knew exactly what he was. She chose him anyway. Think about what just happened. Jochebed let her son go and had him return to her arms before the day was out. She was paid by Pharaoh's own household to nurse and raise her own son. The decree that was meant to destroy this child had instead placed him at the heart of the empire. Safe, royal, hidden. And when he was old enough, he went to live with Pharaoh's daughter. She named him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. She had no idea how prophetic that name would turn out to be. Moses grew up inside the contradiction of his own life. He was a Hebrew living as an Egyptian. He was a slave's son sitting at the table of the enslaver. And for years, it seems, he managed to hold these two truths apart inside himself. He was a prince. He was educated. He was powerful. He had everything a man in the ancient world could want. But the older he got, the harder it became to keep those two worlds separate. One day, Moses went out among his people. He saw their forced labor, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man, one of his own people. Something inside him, held back for years, perhaps his whole life, broke loose. He looked around, saw no one watching, and killed the Egyptian. He buried the body in the sand. He thought no one saw. He was wrong. Pharaoh's reaction was swift. He ordered Moses killed. And so Moses, raised in a palace, destined for royalty, educated in the greatest civilization on earth, ran. He fled into the desert with nothing but his life, leaving behind every comfort, every privilege, every certainty he had ever known. He ran to the land of Midian, a wilderness, a nowhere place. And there, at a well, exhausted and alone, he sat down. Moses had spent 40 years preparing to be a prince, and in one day it was all gone. His identity, his status, his home, his future, all of it stripped away in a single act of impulse. But sometimes, God has to strip away who we think we are before he can show us who we were always meant to be. Moses sat down at that well thinking his story was over. It was only just beginning. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian. 40 years. The same amount of time he had spent in the palace. He had gone from the most powerful household in the world to following sheep around a desert. He had no title, no army, no authority. He was, by any human measure, nobody. But while Moses was learning the desert, its paths, its wells, its seasons, its silence, something was happening back in Egypt. The Hebrew people were crying out. The Bible records a moment that should give every person alive a chill. It says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He saw the Israelites and was concerned about them. 4 verbs. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God was concerned. Nothing about their situation had yet changed. They were still slaves. The whips were still cracking. The bricks were still being made. But in heaven, something had been activated. The prayers of a suffering people had been heard, and the response was already in motion. It just had to start with one man, alone in a desert, following sheep. Here's a small detail that most people miss when they read this story. Moses walked toward the burning bush. He didn't run. He wasn't struck down, overwhelmed, or paralyzed with fear. Not yet. He was curious. He wanted to understand. And that step toward the mystery, that willingness to move closer rather than away, is what made everything that followed possible. I will turn aside and see this great sight, he said to himself. Why is the bush not burning up? Moses. Moses, his name, spoken twice. Here I am, Moses answered, as if he had been waiting his whole life for someone to say his name like that. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then the voice said something that shook Moses to his core. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God said the 6 most powerful sentences Moses had ever heard. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Imagine what was happening inside Moses at that moment. He was 80 years old. He had been a shepherd in the middle of nowhere for 40 years. The last time he had been in Egypt, he had fled as a fugitive wanted for murder. He was the least likely person in the known world to walk back into the throne room of the most powerful man on earth and say, "Let my people go." And Moses said exactly what you and I would have said. He said, "Who am I?" 3 questions, 3 arguments, 3 layers of fear. Who am I to go? What shall I tell them your name is? What if they don't believe me? And then, after God answered every single objection, Moses played his last card. "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." And God said something that has echoed through centuries of doubt and inadequacy. Who gave human beings their mouths? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Moses had spent 40 years in a palace preparing to be powerful. He had spent 40 years in a desert learning to be humble. God was waiting for both. The most dangerous man in the room is not the one who thinks he can do everything. It is the one who has been stripped of every reason for confidence in himself and is therefore forced to trust entirely in something greater. Moses took his staff, he said goodbye to his family, and he turned his face toward Egypt. The most epic rescue mission in history had begun. Before we leave part 1, let's take a moment to absorb what we have seen. A baby, born under a death sentence, placed on a river, and drawn out to become a prince. A man shaped by privilege and stripped by failure, now called from obscurity to step into destiny. And a God who sees, who hears, who is concerned, and who has already set the rescue in motion before the first prayer is even finished. In part 2, Moses returns to Egypt. He stands before Pharaoh, and the most staggering series of supernatural events in the Old Testament begins to unfold, culminating in a night that Egypt will never recover from. If you have never seen what happens when God decides to move on behalf of his people, you do not want to miss part 2. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will see you there.